Everyone knows the Great Wall of China, but raise your hand if you've heard of the Great Hedge of India. You're not alone if you haven't. This was a living 2,500-mile thorn barrier built by the British Empire across the entire Indian subcontinent. It stood for decades as one of the largest man-made structures on Earth. And unlike the Great Wall, it wasn't built for defense. It was built for extraction. Today, I want to pull this forgotten monument out of the shadows and ask, why was it erased and what does its story demand of us now? Here's our path. We'll start with salt, why it was the oil of the British Empire in India. Then we'll see how the inland customs line turned into the Great Hedge. We'll examine the staggering scale of this living fortress. Then we confront the human cost, the suffering, the famines, the millions of lives, and finally, we ask what this forgotten history demands of us today. To understand the hedge, you have to understand salt. In 19th century India, salt wasn't a seasoning, it was survival. In a tropical climate where people lost salt through sweat every day, it was as essential as water. And here's the key. Salt could only be produced on the coasts. The vast interior of the subcontinent depended entirely on imports. Every empire that ruled India from Chandragupta Maurya onward knew this and taxed it. But none turned that tax into an instrument of mass suffering, quite like the British. The British East India Company looked at this geography and saw a perfect monopoly. Salt was produced on the coasts of Orissa and the Rann of Kutch. The interior, hundreds of millions of people had to buy it. So the company slapped on a massive salt tax and built customs houses at every crossing point. But smugglers found ways around isolated checkpoints. The solution? Connect them all into one continuous, impenetrable barrier. That was the birth of the Great Hedge. Look at this animation. The shield represents the hedge, protecting those tax coins from the rain of smuggling. That was the logic. Now here's the staggering part. Of those 2,504 miles of customs line, over 100 miles became a living hedge. Just pause and picture that. A wall of living, growing, thorny vegetation stretching from Berlin to Moscow. That's the scale we're talking about. The British didn't just build checkpoints, they grew a botanical monster across an entire subcontinent. And by 1878, it had reached what Commissioner W.S. Halsey called its greatest extent and perfection. So what did this thing actually look like? It wasn't a neatly trimmed garden hedge. This was a living fortress, a dense, thorn-choked barrier of Indian plum, acacia, and prickly pear. In places it stood 12 feet tall and 14 feet across. It was so thick that smugglers couldn't cut through it, and so hardy that even fire struggled to clear it. The British had weaponized botany. Let me give you the dimensions. 12 feet tall, that's nearly twice the height of an average person. 14 feet across, wider than a London double-decker bus, is long. And it was alive. That meant it grew, thickened, and reinforced itself year after year. Alan Octavian Hume, the botanist and administrator who championed the hedge in the 1860s, experimented with different plant species for different soils and rainfall conditions. This was a massive exercise in biological engineering, all to keep salt from reaching the people who needed it. The machinery behind this hedge was staggering. Over 12,000 men were employed just to maintain it, patrolling, trimming, reinforcing, pursuing smugglers. It took 30 years to reach its full extent, from the 1840s through to 1878. In a single year, over 6,000 smugglers were convicted trying to breach it. And then in 1879, just 1 year after it reached its peak, the whole thing was abandoned. Salt tax enforcement moved to the borders. The hedge was left to decay, and within decades it had vanished from memory almost entirely. Now we have to confront the hardest part of this story. The hedge wasn't just a curiosity or an engineering marvel. It was an instrument of suffering on a massive scale. The salt tax it enforced didn't just make salt expensive, it made salt unaffordable for millions. And in a tropical climate, salt deprivation isn't discomfort. It's weakness, disease, and death. Let's sit with that for a moment. The Avery Review has called the salt tax perhaps the cruelest form of extraction in the British Empire. Sir John Strachey and other British officials documented what they were doing. inflating salt prices, punishing smugglers, and extracting revenue from the poorest of the poor. The health consequences were devastating. Salt deprivation weakened immune systems, making people vulnerable to disease. And when famine struck, as it did repeatedly under British rule, salt-deprived bodies were the first to succumb. This was not collateral damage, this was policy. And the hedge was the wall that made it possible. I want to leave you with this quote from a British official in the 1870s. He compared the hedge to the Great Wall of China, and he was right about the scale. But here's what he didn't say, and what we must say now. The Great Wall was built to protect a civilization. The Great Hedge was built to exploit one. One is a wonder of the world, celebrated and preserved. The other was erased, deliberately forgotten by the empire that built it. The question is, do we let it stay forgotten, or do we insist on remembering? Let's close with this. For over a century, the Great Hedge of India, one of the most ambitious and cruel colonial projects ever built, has been almost completely erased from public memory. While the Great Wall of China is celebrated worldwide, this 2,500-mile living barrier, which enforced attacks that starved and sickened millions, was simply forgotten. The historian Roy Moxham had to use GPS devices and crumbling colonial maps just to locate its faint physical traces in the Agra and Jhansi districts. The hedge itself is gone, but the history it represents demands to be seen, taught, and reckoned with openly. Because a world that forgets how empire profited from human suffering is a world that risks repeating those very mistakes. Thank you.